You see back here a scanning pile I have for some historical stuff. Probably a good thing they didn't remove me from the historical committee. Vengeful bitches. Chapter 10. We celebrated the president's birthday today by making a major breakthrough in the negotiations. So this is dealing with Kissinger in Paris, negotiating with the North Vietnamese. Details the various locations they went to. I don't think that's really important for us here. And so, it starts with Kissinger knew that the pounding had taken its toll on North Vietnam. Excuse me. Whew. I was doing some dusting earlier. For the reasons you will understand, Kissinger wrote in a back-channel message to Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker in Vietnam. I cannot emphasize too strongly the importance of avoiding any implication of gloating over our success at getting the other side back to talks, or the implication that our strong actions forced this result on them. And for these same reasons, Nixon steered clear of even debating the issue of whether or not the bombing caused widespread civilian casualties. But getting a deal done would be tricky. For one thing, Kissinger did not trust the communists. On January 3rd, he privately told the ambassador of the Republic of Vietnam, which was South Vietnam, that he was under no illusions as he returned to the negotiating table. They are a bunch of SOBs, he said. They are the worst I have seen. It was a pleasure to bomb them. They are totally treacherous. Now, the South Vietnamese were a sticking point. And I don't think they fully comprehended how close they were to just losing any backup from the United States at all. And they were obsessed primarily, it says, with one issue, the continued presence of North Vietnamese troops in the South once a ceasefire was declared. And what Kissinger was trying, and Nixon was trying to impress upon them is, while the American people did not have a taste to continue this war as it is, in a negotiation, they could set down terms for peace. They were convinced the North Vietnamese were treacherous communists that would violate it, and then the American people would have a taste for enforcing the terms of peace. And so several issues still divided the parties, and the United States was in the thorny position of representing not only its interests, but also those of the South Vietnamese, who were not participants in the meetings. The central definitional difficulty in drafting revolved around the concept of Vietnam as one nation. The North Vietnamese, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, saw one nation following the settlement. This had been envisioned by the 1954 Geneva Conference at the end of the First Indochina War, when the country was partitioned into two zones, North and South, and separated by a military demarcation line, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, nominally at the 17th parallel, which was always meant to be provisional. Reunification was supposed to follow free elections in July 1956, but the elections never happened. So, drafting off the Geneva Conference, Kissinger and Tho, who was the North Vietnamese representative, proposed free elections to determine the political future of Vietnam. And the South, the contest would be between the Saigon government, known as the Government of Vietnam, and the Communist National Liberation Front, which became known as the Provisional Revolutionary Government, or the Viet Cong. Now, the president of South Vietnam had some problems with this. He needed to contain and eventually run out the existing North Vietnamese troops that would be left in the South, and he needed to politically defeat the Viet Cong in any general elections, thus establishing his claim to a separate government for South Vietnam. So the two issues left to hammer out were the nature of the DMZ and the signing procedure for the accords, because the South Vietnamese absolutely did not want to look like they were recognizing the Viet Cong as legitimate. So the North Vietnamese at first wanted to allow military vehicles across the DMZ, but they finally decided to compromise on that question, and the final language would only refer to civilian movement. And they began discussions in earnest on a signing method that would greatly lessen the problem of implied recognition for the Viet Cong. Kissinger sent Nixon a message that basically these improvements, these positive developments in the negotiations were Nixon's birthday present, and he was very excited about that. And it says, on January 9th, with all his mania for secrecy, the president and Bob Haldeman spoke on Nixon's birthday about, irony of ironies, concealed devices within the White House that would soon play a determinative role in sending Nixon back into political oblivion. 2 hours after Kissinger's cable arrived, Nixon and Haldeman struck up a casual conversation about the secret White House taping system. Only a handful of people knew about it: Nixon, Haldeman, Butterfield, and a few others. Kissinger, Ehrlichman, Dean, Colson, Haig, and many others had no clue. And Nixon claimed his reason for installing this system in the first place was if someone ever wanted to write a history of his presidency. And this is fascinating to me. It really makes me wonder, because I find this difficult to believe. Then the two men said something that, in hindsight, was fairly amazing. Neither one seemed to know or remember that Nixon's office in the Executive Office Building had been bugged for as long as the Oval Office, nor did they know that Camp David had a recording system installed. Something is weird here. I don't believe that Nixon would have just forgot. And what do they mean? They didn't know. There's a lot of unanswered questions here for me. And Nixon actually said, so Haldeman said, the recording system covers the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room. And Nixon said, you should put it in the EOB too. So he did not think there was one in there. And then he said, Nixon said, I wouldn't put it in other places like Camp David because I make my own notes. But the EOB, they both agreed, was different and would save Nixon from having to recall some things, like speaking to Chuck Colson about clemency for Hunt. This is the author's little aside. The EOB is where Nixon had all of his conversations with Colson about Hunt and his request for executive clemency. And the location of these discussions may not have been an accident. Given this exchange so close in time to the clemency discussions, it seems probable that Nixon felt his EOB office was a safe place to talk of such things. He did not want to leave a record. So who put that system in there? Was it just that he gave broad direction to the company that did it, the installers, and they made that decision? So it says the obsession with secrecy within the Nixon White House was so profound that even Richard Nixon himself did not know the full reach of the taping system. It refers to EndNote 34, and I want to look at this. EndNote 34 in Chapter 10. There's a lot of notes in here. Okay. Now it just refers to what tape this was in. This was brushed over here. I think there is a lot more meat on that bone. 10 months later, in Oslo, Norway, and this is how this chapter ends, in a surprising and controversial move, Henry Kissinger and Tho would be jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 1973. Kissinger accepted and donated his share of the cash prize to a scholarship fund for children of American servicemen killed or missing in action in Indochina. Tho refused to accept the prize and politely declined to attend. He said the war was not over and peace was yet to be realized. Remember, Tho was the representative from North Vietnam. That's the end of chapter 10. All right, now to chapter 11. This is going back to the Watergate trial and all the issues with Judge Sirica. The name of the chapter is He Can Renew It After the Opening Statement is Made. And I don't know if I do quote, I think, where this came from, but basically it came from one of Sirica's statements when he was rejecting the plea deal and said that Hunt can renew it after opening statements. I want to flip through here. There's a lot of direct quotes I'm giving in this chapter, like a lot, because it really details what happened having to do with the Watergate trial, which is really what I wanted to focus on in doing this book. So I thought it was really important for those of you who might not be as educated about this really important part of American history as I am. So hopefully there'll be people for which this is useless, but this is going to take a little while. Alrighty. It says Hunt did not want to go to trial. He wanted to plead guilty. Bittman relayed this to Judge Sirica. And Bittman added, I will add that during the course of discussions with the government, I have made a statement to the government on behalf of my client, which is something they requested and part of our discussions, and that is, to Mr. Hunt's personal knowledge, that there are no so-called higher-ups involved in the so-called Watergate episode. And then the author adds, in a move that is always dangerous for a lawyer, Bittman took the unusual step of actually vouching for his client's statement, saying, I believe that statement to be truthful and accurate. And Silbert did the same thing, basically vouched for Hunt. Silbert was not a very good prosecutor. So it says, Sirica was frosted. The only statement I have to make is at this time I am going to deny his request without prejudice. That is all I have to say, period. And then Sirica, however, did end up saying more and said, I might say that if he does plead guilty to the entire indictment, to every count, I have the question of commitment to consider after conviction, so I'm not going to decide that now. I don't want to go into it. So Sirica was rejecting a deal the prosecutors found acceptable, and then implicitly threatening Bittman with severe sentencing and immediate commitment to jail if Hunt did not plead to the entire case. Sirica was acting as prosecutor, judge, and executioner. He didn't really care about Hunt's scalp per se. He wanted to assert maximum pressure to cause Hunt to spill what he knew about who was behind the Watergate break-in. Then Bittman said, okay, he'll plead to all of the counts. And Sirica still would not accept the plea deal. And Sirica was unyielding and said, I'm denying the request at this time without prejudice. He can renew it after the opening statement is made or after the evidence is offered by the government. The record is clear. Bittman could only exclaim, good God! He was given no choice. He would renew his request after opening statements. Then one of the who was this Campbell? Campbell was another lawyer for the prosecution who was very methodical. Followed up on a phone call And when he did, it says, a student from Brigham Young University in Provo answered the phone and agreed to be interviewed. An FBI agent showed up at his apartment on December 19th and 20th. The student's name was Thomas James Gregory. Tom Gregory was a close friend of the nephew of Robert Bennett, who had been Howard Hunt's boss at the public relations firm of Robert R. Mullen and Company, where Hunt landed after retiring from the CIA. Bennett, a conservative with ties to Howard Hughes, would later become a 3-term senator from Utah. It was widely believed at the time that Mullen and Company acted as a CIA front. Hunt worked there, often using the pseudonym Edward Warren. Paid $175 a week, Gregory ended up working as a faux volunteer for the Muskie and later McGovern campaigns, reporting back to Hunt on matters such as scheduling, bank records, dissension in the ranks, and speeches. Then in late May, Gregory told the FBI he intended a meeting, just making sure it's recording, in a room at the Manger Hamilton Hotel with Hunt, McCord, Liddy, and the Cubans. The group discussed bugging McGovern's campaign headquarters. Gregory grew increasingly concerned with what he was doing, and with the help of Bob Bennett, who drafted a letter for him to give to Howard Hughes, quit several days before the second Watergate break-in. Nevertheless, there was a critical link, placing McCord, Liddy, Hunt, and the Cubans in a meeting discussing a plan to wiretap McGovern's headquarters around the time of the first break-in at the Watergate. And unlike the screwy and absent-minded Baldwin, Gregory was clear and consistent in his account. Now I'm going to read Silbert's opening statement, at least all of it that's given in here, because it lays out the government's presentation of the case. May it please the court, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Silbert began. But what he was about to do would turn out to be anything but pleasing to the court. This was Silbert's chance to lay out the entire case for the jury, provide the roadmap, as trial lawyers call it. But it became instantly clear that he was going to build his case around the lies Magruder and Porter had spun. The cover story was going to become the prosecution's story. Liddy and Hunt would be painted as rogues working outside their scope of authority. The clear implication was that the buck stopped with them. No higher authorities were mixed up in the affair. After reviewing the counts in the indictment and briefly introducing the cast of characters, Silbert jumped straight into Magruder's sham surrogate's explanation for why Liddy had so much money at his disposal, and Silbert adopted it as his own. Liddy, Silbert said, had been hired by the committee to re-elect in December 71. He was to report to Magruder, who will be a witness in this case. Magruder was then deputy campaign manager for the committee for the re-election of the president. Bart Porter, Magruder's top assistant, was also introduced. And as will be explained to you, at that time the president was not planning on doing much campaigning in the primaries. In his place, there was going to be what used to be called surrogate candidates. They were going to be stand-ins for the president at the open primaries being held in such states as New Hampshire, Florida, and Wisconsin. Silbert reminded the juries of demonstrations and extremist groups that threatened political campaign events, images that dominated television and news reports at that time. Naturally, the CRP, Magruder, and Porter would fear for the safety of their surrogates. Magruder and Porter turned to Liddy and gave him an assignment. Liddy was given $100,000, $1,000 per month for 10 people for 10 months to buy intelligence and protection for the surrogates. Silbert, like Magruder, could not explain why no one could identify any of these 10 people around the country who were to be paid this money. Magruder gave Liddy a second assignment, to protect the Republican convention. To make it seem real, Silbert, buying Magruder's line, said, they had in mind the unfortunate experiences of the Democratic Party in Chicago in 1968 that some of you might recall. This was a reference to the infamous bloody riot outside the 68 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where anti-war students and activists were brutally beaten by Mayor Richard Daley's police forces. It all seemed plausible. For the second assignment, Silbert said, Liddy was allocated an additional $150,000. Silbert conceded that of the total $250,000 that Liddy was given, the government could only document spending for about $50,000. This massive hole in the proofs did not trouble Silbert. He would let Magruder explain that the CRP was simply poor at record keeping, and Liddy was the only one who really knew where the money was spent. An improbable explanation given normal campaign record keeping practices. We cannot account for the rest, Silbert simply asserted. Silbert spent the balance of his opening focusing mainly on the twin stories of Gregory and Baldwin. Gregory would tie McCord, Hunt, Liddy, and the Cubans to the failed attempt at planting devices at McGovern's headquarters. Baldwin would tell a story of the operations at the Howard Johnson listening post and the multiple Watergate break-ins. Silbert had more than enough from these two witnesses to hang the two men he was most worried about, Hunt and Liddy, neither of whom had been arrested at the scene, although Hunt left a good deal of circumstantial evidence pointing to his involvement. Deliberately or not, Silbert emphasized Hunt's involvement and role in the crimes, knowing all the while that Hunt was going to plead guilty immediately after the openings. Hunt was portrayed darkly as one of the two free-spending, high-living masterminds of the espionage schemes, with Liddy, his boon friend and travel companion, as the ultimate boss. Silbert pointed out that Hunt and Liddy stayed at only the fanciest and priciest hotels, including the Playboy Plaza Hotel in Miami and the Beverly Wilshire in Los Angeles, although Silbert neglected to tell them that he himself had visited Playboy Plaza in December as part of a last-minute fact-finding mission to Florida to prepare for trial. Silbert concluded his opening remarks by doing two things that were guaranteed to anger Judge Sirica. He went to lengths to distance Magruder from Liddy. Magruder and Liddy did not get along, he said. Magruder was younger and in charge, and Liddy did not like taking orders from him. Magruder never knew who Liddy was and didn't like the kind of reports he made either. They had a blow-up, and at the end of March or early April, Liddy left and went downstairs to work for the Finance Committee. Magruder, Silbert was emphasizing, had no idea what Liddy was up to. He was a black box to Magruder. And the coup de grace had to be Silbert's discussion of Sirica's favorite hobby horse, Motive. Though perhaps Silbert was trying to respond to Sirica's repeated prodding on the topic, he did nothing but muddy the waters and sow confusion. The question may have arisen in your minds during this opening statement as I described events and facts the government will produce before you during the course of this trial. What were the motives behind this conduct? What were the reasons for their activities? Here is where Sirica had to have perked up. Silbert seemed to be headed in the right direction when he said, obviously, it was a political motive. The operation was directed against the Democratic Party, particularly Senator McGovern, because of his alleged left-wing views. Sirica would have thought so far so good, but then Silbert began veering off course badly. The interest of the persons, the defendants in this case, may vary. That is, the motivation of Hunt and Liddy may have been different from the motivations of the four defendants from Miami, and they in turn may have had a different motivation than defendant McCord. What did Silbert mean? Certainly the facts will suggest, based on the information we produce, it was a financial motive, he said. Financial motive! Exclamation point. Sirica had to have privately growled. Silbert spent the final minutes of his remarks outlining in great detail how desperate the financial straits were for the Cubans and McCord. They were in this because of money, plain and simple. That was their motive, money. It was a complete sideshow. It drew attention away from the CRP and the White House, and it made the trial about personal crimes of individuals who were nothing but common thieves engaged in crime sprees because they were hard up for money. If Nixon had been present in the courtroom, he could not have been more pleased with this recitation of the facts. And I thought that gave a really good picture. Now, the attorney for the Cubans, Rothblatt, Alk, who was the attorney for McCord, gave a very short opening. But Rothblatt was not having that. He wanted his spotlight. So, I'm going to read his thing, or at least the important parts of it. Rothblatt had flair. "May it please your honor," he boomed grandiosely. "Colleagues on the prosecution side and my brothers on the defense side, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I proudly represent that I speak for all four of the accused in this case: Virgilio Gonzalez, Rolando Martinez, Frank Fiorini Sturgis, and Bernard Baker." And he practically took a bow. Based on a letter that would be delivered by the Miami defendants to Judge Sirica before the week was out, it would become clear that none of these defendants wanted Rothblatt to make the arguments he was about to make. I am sure that all of you were moved, as I was, when we heard the prosecution story presentation, the outline of proof presented by the prosecution, by Silbert, he said to the jury. It was thorough, it was dramatic, and it was moving. One could almost feel the Miamians telling him to sit down under their breath. Rothblatt said he labored under an immense burden. Silbert not only presented a good story, and he would be sure to call it a story several times, but was also aided by the most thorough investigation undertaken by the FBI, the Department of Justice, since the death of President Kennedy. Rothbard conceded that his clients were caught red-handed in the Watergate. "We might as well close that chapter as far as they are concerned," he said. He wanted the jury to pay close attention to criminal intent, evil mind, and motives. Rothbard then launched into a rambling monologue about the character of the defendants. "A man's character does not change," he said. "Take Mr. Barker, for example, a Cuban citizen of mixed heritage. When our country was involved in the Second World War, on Pearl Harbor Day, even though he had Cuban citizenship, the evidence will show that he was the first to go to the American embassy to enlist in our army to serve our country. He went on to become an officer in our Air Force. He was shot down over Germany and kept in a Nazi prison camp for over a year. And later he was discharged as a captain. Honorably discharged as a captain in the United States Army and returned to civilian life." Then Mr. Glanzer asked if they could approach the bench. And Sirica admonished him, "You're supposed to use your opening not for argument, but to show what you intended to prove." So, Rothblatt continued to talk about the impeccable character of his clients. Sturgis was also a veteran of World War II, and the evidence will show he has led a life devoted to making himself available to people who want to see democratic systems of justice prevail, particularly in this part of the atmosphere. Sirica had heard enough. "Now let's get down to the reason he went into the Watergate," he stormed. "Let's get down to the motive you've been talking about. Let's find out what the facts are." Rothblatt responded by saying all of his clients were part of, quote-unquote, our government and served in planned operations such as the Bay of Pigs. They were men who took orders in a military fashion and never questioned orders. Rothblatt sounded strangely like he was arguing the My Lai court-martial all over again. These were men who were used to serving their government loyally and following orders. Though the Cubans wanted to sack Rothblatt at that very moment, he was no longer under their control. He thoughtlessly agreed with Sirica. "I think the evidence, even as outlined by Silbert, shows that, in part, Your Honor, shows that they were taking orders to go into the Watergate." Rothblatt's remarks had become a circus and a disaster for the defendants. Then Bittman got up, repeated many of the arguments made in private the day before to the judge, asked the court to accept the plea deal in which Hunt would plead guilty to 3 of the 6 counts against him. Silbert strongly urged that the court approve the deal. Sirica took a 15-minute break, and when he came back, he asked why Hunt would not just plead to the entire case. After a back and forth, Sirica said he had not made up his mind about whether to accept the plea, but he warned Hunt and any other defendant who might be thinking about changing his plea, that he would put him in jail immediately if he pled guilty. That was Soroka's policy. But Soroka didn't want to have a trial. He did not want everyone suddenly running for the hills and pleading guilty. No, it says Soroka clearly wanted to have a trial. Excuse me. He did not want everyone running for the hills and pleading guilty. Hunt did not want a trial. Then Nixon and Ziegler talked. Ziegler said, "We do not need to comment on this. It's not our problem, not a White House problem." But Hunt pleaded guilty, and both the Times and Post had big stories about it, Nixon asked. "What the hell is there?" he asked. "This was a non-story. Everyone knows they're guilty." And that is it for Chapter 11, and I am up to where I read, and it's about just shy of halfway through.